In December 2006, in a quiet suburb of Delhi called Nithari, authorities discovered something that would shake India to its core. Body parts, children's clothing, decomposed remains stuffed in an underground drain. In the following weeks, one man, Surinder Koli, a domestic servant, would confess to unimaginable acts: murder, sexual assault, dismemberment, and most shockingly, cannibalism.
मेरी भी इच्छा होती थी, मेरे अंदर का शैतान जाग उठता था.
He said in a confession that would haunt India for nearly 2 decades. But here's what's important to understand. Surinder Koli's confession has now been questioned. The Supreme Court acquitted him in 2025, citing coerced confessions and investigative failures. The truth of what happened may never be fully known. But what we can do is examine the neuroscience behind extreme violence, serial killing, and behavioral escalation, because that knowledge might help us prevent the next tragedy. Welcome to Neuro Explore. Today, we're going inside the brain of someone capable of extreme violence. Not to glorify, but to understand, because understanding is the only path to prevention. Before we talk about the neuroscience, let's understand the facts of the case, because they matter. The discovery. In December 2006, residents of Nithari village reported finding the remains of missing children in the sewer behind a bungalow in Sector 31, Noida. When authorities excavated, they found decomposed body parts, children's clothing, and skeletal remains. At least 19 young women and children were reported missing in the area over the previous 2 years. This was a tragedy that devastated families and shocked an entire nation. The investigation. Police arrested 2 people, Muninder Singh Pandher, the house owner, and Surinder Koli, the domestic servant. Koli, under interrogation for 60 days, eventually confessed to murdering at least 6 children and 1 young woman, sexual assault, dismemberment, alleged cannibalism, and necrophilia. But here's where it gets complex. In 2025, nearly 19 years later, the Supreme Court of India acquitted Koli. The judges found that his confession was likely coerced, evidence was contaminated or inconclusive, the crime scene was mishandled. Investigators ignored alternative leads, including organ trade theories. Forensic evidence simply didn't substantiate the cannibalism claims. So, did Surinder Koli commit these crimes? We may never know for certain. The case remains one of India's most haunting unsolved mysteries. But what we learned from this case is incredibly important for understanding how the human brain can become capable of extreme violence. And that's what we are going to explore today. Let me show you something fascinating and deeply disturbing at the same time. When neuroscientists examine the brains of people convicted of serial murder, they find something consistently different. Brain abnormalities. Measurable, real, documentable. Brain imaging shows reduced amygdala activity, empathy center, underactive prefrontal cortex, rational brake, dopamine dysregulation, reward system broken. When you see pain, your amygdala activates. You feel empathy. In a serial killer, the amygdala doesn't respond. Pain is just visual information. The prefrontal cortex, your rational brake, is also damaged. No voice saying don't do this. Result: impulse, action, no moral filter. Adrian Rain's neuroimaging studies show consistent brain deficits in murderers. One of the most important mechanisms in serial killing is this progression: fantasy to reality. And it's rooted in something called the pathological neural watermark hypothesis. This is a cutting-edge neuroscience theory that explains how sexual fantasies become real violent acts. Step 1. Fantasy develops. Often starting in childhood or adolescence, a person, usually due to trauma, develops a deviant sexual fantasy. This isn't random. It's usually connected to trauma they experienced. Sexual abuse victims sometimes fantasize about reversing their role, becoming the perpetrator instead of the victim. This is a defense mechanism.
I'm no longer the helpless victim. I am the powerful one.
Fantasy provides relief. The person rehearses it repeatedly. Step 2. Neural encoding. Each rehearsal creates a specific neural pattern. Brain regions activate in sequence, hippocampus to amygdala to nucleus accumbens. This pattern becomes automatic. Step 3. Stimulus triggers. Once this neural pattern is encoded, specific triggers activate it. A particular look, a location. Fantasy automatically activates. Step 4. Escalation. Here's where the escalation happens. For months or years, the person relieves their trauma through fantasy, but the brain adapts. Dopamine response decreases. The fantasies become more graphic, more violent, more real in their mind, and eventually, fantasy isn't enough anymore. The brain is saying,
I need to make this real.
Step 5. The first act. When they finally act on the fantasy, something happens neurologically. The fantasy becomes an autobiographical memory. In their brain, it's now a real experience, not an imaginary one. And real experiences are stored differently in memory. They're more emotionally intense, they're more rewarding. The dopamine surge from the real act is massive compared to fantasy. Studies on serial killers show that after the first act, there's a clear pattern of behavioral escalation. Victims become more mutilated, methods become more sadistic, frequency of killings increases over time. Step 6. Addiction cycle. Each kill produces less dopamine unless violence escalates. More victims, more extreme, more sadistic, chasing that first high that becomes impossible to reach. How this works in serial killers. A person with early violent fantasies might be horrified by them initially.
This is wrong. I shouldn't think like this.
But they're stressed, they're traumatized. The fantasy helps them cope. So they fantasize again and again and again. Each time they fantasize about violence, their brain's emotional response to that violence decreases. What once seemed horrifying becomes normal. What once seemed unthinkable becomes thinkable. Research shows that people who expose themselves to large amounts of violent media become desensitized to real violence. Their brains literally become less sensitive to violence. But in serial killers, the desensitization happens internally through their own fantasy. The normalization effect. Once someone is desensitized to violence through repeated fantasy, something shifts. They stop seeing violence as abnormal. They stop seeing violence as wrong. Instead, violence becomes a tool, a strategy, a solution to their emotional problems. When they're angry, violence is how you fix it. When they're sexually frustrated, violence is how you satisfy it. When they feel powerless, violence is how you become powerful. Their schema, their mental framework for understanding the world, now includes violence as normal and acceptable. So here's what's wild. Serial murder isn't pure evil. It's brain abnormalities plus childhood trauma plus behavioral conditioning plus dopamine dysregulation plus fantasy escalation. The person is responsible, but they're acting with a broken brain, and that matters. And this matters not because it excuses their behavior, it doesn't, but because it explains it. Understand, right? Childhood abuse rewires the developing brain. The HPA axis, stress system, stays constantly activated. Cortisol chronically elevated. Amygdala becomes hypersensitive and prefrontal cortex underdevelops. Result? An adult with hypervigilance, poor impulse control, dysregulated emotions. Desensitization follows. First time seeing violence? Shocking. 10th time? Less shocking. 100th time? Normal. Repeated exposure, whether fantasy or media, decreases emotional response. Violence becomes a tool. A solution: when angry, use violence. When frustrated, use violence. When powerless, use violence becomes the strategy. Early intervention might prevent this. Brain imaging can reveal deficits early. Trauma intervention can prevent brain changes. Therapy can rewire stress responses. Medication can treat dopamine dysregulation. Understanding this might help us identify at-risk individuals, intervene before violence, prevent the next tragedy. Not because killers are robots, but because understanding why helps us when. The Nithari case may never be solved, but we learned something crucial. Serial killers aren't monsters. They're people with broken brains, unhealed trauma, and escalating compulsions. Understanding this isn't about excusing violence. It's about preventing it. By identifying at-risk children, by treating trauma early, by taking violent fantasies seriously. This is how we stop the next tragedy. This is NeuroExplore, understanding the brain, protecting society. If this episode made you look at the Nithari case and our justice system a little differently, don't just scroll away. Hit like so this kind of content doesn't get buried. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Koli was a killer, a scapegoat, or something far more complicated? And if you want more deep dives into the psychology and neuroscience behind India's darkest cases, subscribe to Neuro Explore and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the brain has many more secrets, and we're just getting started.